Good evening. I'm Wayne Thomas, Executive Director for the Plumbing, Heating, Cooling Contractors of Massachusetts, and I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting here tonight. We would like to go over the current code changes promulgated by the board recently. I'd like to start by going over each of the sets of code changes section by section. As we finish with each section, we'll stop and ask questions and hopefully be able to answer them for you. So before we go into section 3, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the general requirements. That would be jobs in progress. So if you had taken out a permit prior to April 30th of 2021, you would follow whatever the old code regulations called for. Any permits taken out after April 30th of 2021, you would have to follow the new code regulations. The board typically doesn't enforce the code retroactively, and that's the reason for that. Now we can move on to section 3. Okay, so the first thing in section 3 we'd like to talk about is the business licensure in relation to a non-plumbing and gas fitting business. So the board allows for non-plumbing and gas fitting businesses to employ apprentices, journeymen, and master plumbers as long as they're working in their own properties. So this would, as an example, I would use a hospital. A hospital might have 4 or 5 buildings. There could be 2 master plumbers, 1 journeyman plumber, and 1 apprentice plumber, just as an example. They do not need to hold a business license. The master plumber can take out permits for the work on that property, and as long as they have the right ratios, they can have apprentices to every journeyman and master plumber that's employed there. When it comes time for the apprentice plumbers to apply to take the journeyman exam, the master plumber that is working for the hospital can sign off on that time for that apprentice plumber. This is also, another analogy would be for a property management company. Only work on that property, but if a property management company managed 4 or 5 buildings or 4 or 5 properties, they would not need a business license because they're not considered to be in the business of plumbing. On section 3, the area on apprentices under general provisions says that apprentices must retain all of the W-2 records for a period of at least 7 years after they receive their journeyman plumber's license. So any apprentices out there, make sure you're saving all your W-2 records. They've got to be saved for 7 years after you get your journeyman's license. This is only there so that if there was ever any question, the board staff could ask for those records to prove that you were actually an apprentice at the time. And apprentices cannot be considered as an independent contractor. Apprentices have to be paid directly through a payroll system. They can't be paid using a 1099. They can't be paid using cash or what is usually referred to as under the table. None of that time will count. If you're working for someone now and that person is paying you using a 1099, paying you with a check but not taking taxes out, or paying you cash, when it comes time to file to take your journeyman exam, that master plumber will have to check off the box that they can't produce the Social Security records that you need. At that time, you won't be allowed to use any of that time. And relating to that too, the employing master plumber is held accountable if they're paying someone under the table, or they're paying someone with a check in the 1099, not taking taxes out. There could be sanctions from the board as well, along with the apprentice, because the apprentice is actually working unlicensed at the time. Okay, so there is one provision that does allow apprentices to work under a master plumber without actually being paid. And that would be if there is a contract, a written contract between the master plumber and the apprentice that's stating they're an unpaid intern. But all that work still has to be done under the direct supervision of the master plumber. You would have to submit that information to the board along with your application to take the journeyman exam. So you have to make sure that the master plumber is keeping good records of all the jobs you're doing, and also the board is going to want to know the reasons that that person is not being paid. On the master's duty regarding an apprentice license under section 3.03, master plumbers in the entities that are not in the plumbing business, like I had said earlier, can sign off on that apprentice work time, but the master plumber also has to have access to those payroll records. So if the application gets submitted and the individual, there's some question from board staff when they're reviewing the application, the master plumber is going to have to be able to provide payroll records that show that that person was working. Under the section of 3.04 and variances, variances cannot be permitted to waive the requirements of Massachusetts law. So one of the things in the Massachusetts law states that they cannot be permitted for education of licensure under 248 CMR 3. So the board cannot grant a variance for someone if they have not got their time counted. So if they let's just say that they had worked for someone for a period of 3 years and thought they were licensed, but actually weren't licensed, the board legally cannot accept that time. Under the section of 3.05 in permits and inspections, there's a section that was entered in there for violations of other codes. When an inspector observes an apparent or actual violation, they're supposed to go in and let the homeowner or the building owner know that there are other violations on the property. That's not the responsibility of the master plumber or the journeyman plumber that's doing the work on the property at the time. So another section in there is under the jurisdiction of inspectors. So an inspector can't deny a permit if a few items are applied to this. So if the applicant has not filled out the permit application properly, the inspector can refuse the permit. If he or she doesn't have a valid license, they can deny the permit at the same time. Now this brings in the question of the gas company employees. There is a provision in the general law that allows gas companies and gas company employees to work in Massachusetts on gas fitting without holding a Massachusetts gas fitter or plumbing license. They don't need permits. They're specifically exempt in our general laws. So you don't need to hold a license if you work directly for a gas company in Massachusetts to be able to perform gas fitting. That doesn't exempt them from the requirements of filing a permit and getting inspections, but they are exempt from having the license. So an inspector can also deny a permit if you don't provide a workers' compensation certificate. With regards to owing back taxes in the town, that question seems to come up quite a bit. An inspector can only, or a town can only refuse to issue a permit to you as a plumber or a gas fitter if you yourself are the person that owes taxes in that town. So if you're going to work in a town and the homeowner or business owner, building owner that you're doing the job in owes back taxes in that town, legally the town cannot refuse that permit because that permit is issued to you. It's not issued to the homeowner or the building owner. There's also a provision that's written into the code now that allows an inspector to provide a written warning to the homeowner about violations that they might see when they come in to do an inspection for a job that you might be doing that has nothing to do with what you're doing. And that wraps up section 3. At this point, I'll take any questions you might have.
Wayne, I have a question about apprenticeship hours. If I worked for the same company for 5 years, but during that time there were 2 different master plumbers of record for that company, who signs off on my time where it's all the same firm?
Good question. I'll summarize that question for those who might not have been able to hear. The question was, if an apprentice plumber works for a company for 5 years, or in this case 4 years now that we've changed the code, and there are maybe 1, 2, 3 different master plumbers that might have been the record holder for the company at the time, who is allowed to sign off on that time? The answer is it's always the master plumber of record at the time the apprentice applies for the exam. So if I'm the master plumber for a company and I just got hired 6 months ago and I have an apprentice working under me that is in his 5th year as an apprentice, I can go back, as long as I can see the records that the company has, I'm allowed to sign off on that time.
Wayne, I have a question. When you were talking about back taxes for homeowners versus contractors and permitting, can you just clarify and explain that a little bit in more detail? Sure.
For the benefit of those who couldn't hear again, I'll just say that this is a question about the back taxes from a homeowner in a particular city or town, which does seem to come up a lot now. The way it works is that plumbing permits, unlike most other permits in cities and towns, are always issued directly to the plumbing contractor. So the law reads that if you owe back taxes in a town, you cannot be issued a permit. So it's technically the plumber or the gas fitter that's taking out the permit. If that particular person owes taxes in that town they're taking a permit out in, the town can refuse to issue that permit. So I'll give you an example. So I have a plumbing company. I'm going to do a job in Needham. I live in Stoughton. I go to take out a permit for a homeowner in Needham. That homeowner in Needham owes back taxes. The town cannot refuse that permit to me because that permit is not being issued to the homeowner, it's being issued to the contractor themselves. The other scenario would be, I live in Stoughton, I'm doing a job for someone in Stoughton, I go to take out a permit in that town, and I owe back taxes in that town. The town can, at that point, refuse issuing the permit to me. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay, on to section 4, and that deals with the definition of a fuel gas. Only one item in this section that we're dealing with, and that's the very beginning of it, says a natural gas, manufactured gas, or other mixture of gases typically combusted, consumed, or otherwise utilized as a source of energy. So prior to this, the words consumed or otherwise utilized weren't part of this definition. Before, it had to be combusted to be considered to be under the jurisdiction of the plumbing board. We had a situation some time ago where there were hydrogen filling stations being put in Massachusetts, and they had piping going from the hydrogen tanks down underground and across to where the fuel pumps were. So that gas, that manufactured gas, was not being combusted. It was being used in the vehicles, but it wasn't being combusted. This now captures that as part of the plumbing code. So going forward, any type of gas that's used as a source of energy would now be considered to be under the jurisdiction of the plumbing board, which means that gas fitters and plumbers would be the people that would be doing that installation. Okay, moving on to section 5. There is one revision that the board made to section 5, and that's the revision about plastic piping for venting. I'm just going to read what the language now says, and then I'll go through a little bit of it afterwards. That is, the only plastic piping which may be used for venting appliances shall be CPVC, polypropylene, and other pipes which have been product accepted for that purpose by the board. So what that essentially means is that if you're going to install any type of plastic venting for gas appliances going forward, you need to first go to the plumbing board's website, you need to go to the product acceptance section and make sure those products are listed before you use them. We've developed a full list of items that are currently listed on the board's website. It may not be a complete list, but at this point, it's the ones we were able to find. This isn't any kind of endorsement for the manufacturers, but I just wanted to give you the list of products that we have been able to find that are currently listed as approved venting materials. So Bernard Dalson Manufacturing has products listed under the gas category. Centrotherm Ecosystems are listed under combo category. Echo Manufacturing are listed under combo and gas. Heart and Cooling under gas. Heat Fab under gas. IPEX USA has 3 listings, all under gas. Metal Fab, MG Duravent, Selkirk, and the Sherber Company all have listings under gas. So those were the ones that we were able to locate. If you have another product and you think it might be approved, you should go onto the website and find it before you do the installation. To that, the board held a meeting on May 5th and developed and voted on a series of frequently asked questions. So what I'll do is I'll read the questions that the board voted on, and I'll give you what their answer was. The first question was, does any piping used to vent a gas appliance need to be listed on the board's website as product accepted, including CPVC and polypropylene? And the answer is yes. Even though the regulation change specifically lists CPVC and polypropylene, they still have to be listed on the board's website in order to be used. If a permit was taken out prior to the regulation becoming effective, but the work and the inspection was not performed until after, does the installation need to comply with the new revisions? And the answer is no, and that was something I discussed back in the area, the very beginning of this, where the board doesn't enforce the code retroactively. So if you have a gas installation that you're venting appliances and the permits were taken out prior to April 30th of 2021, you would follow whatever the previous requirements were. Next question was, if a gas appliance is being replaced and the existing gas piping is buried in the wall or ceiling, does the concealed piping also need to be brought up to the current code, or just the new piping necessary to install the appliance? So as of this point, the answer would be, if the concealed piping is not being removed or altered, it is considered part of an existing system. And if in compliance with the code at the time that the installation was done, they would not need to replace that piping via the current code. So if you're allowed to leave anything in place that was code compliant at the time it was installed, provided it's in good working order. The exemption would be if the manufacturer of the new appliance prohibits the use of the existing venting material. So in other words, if you've got a gas appliance that is being replaced and the venting used PVC before, and the new gas appliance you're putting in, the manufacturer of that appliance doesn't allow PVC, you would have to remove it and replace it. And the other exemption would be if the existing visible or exposed gas piping has been compromised, all of the piping would need to be replaced. The next question was, IPEX is listed on the board's website as an accepted material to vent gas appliances, which makes it allowable under the regulation change. If the manufacturer of an appliance you're installing does not list this item as an allowable venting material for their appliance, can you still use it because the board allows it? And the answer would be no. In this case, the appliance manufacturer's prohibition would be more stringent and must be followed. So the appliance doesn't list, and we're just using IPEX as an example, it could be Centrotherm, it could be Duravent, could be any of the other ones. If the appliance manufacturer, the gas vented appliance, does not list that product as an acceptable material, you're not allowed to use it. Next question was, is all PVC banned as a gas venting material? And the answer is no. PVC is not banned. All plastic piping needs to be product accepted by the board in order to be used. If a PVC manufacturer submits their product to the board office and it's deemed good enough if it's tested to the proper standard, then the board could approve it and then you'd be able to use it. But at this point, there is no PVC, regular PVC that is listed on the board's website as an approved venting material. Next question was, what standards are required for plastic piping to be granted product acceptance for gas venting? And the answer to that is from the board is the board doesn't designate specific standards for product acceptance. Rather, they rely on neutral third parties to ensure the products are safe and appropriate for their intended use. If a particular appliance manufacturer's installation instructions allow PVC as a venting option, can I use it? And the answer to that would be the allowance for PVC as a venting option in the manufacturer's instructions is not sufficient. PVC has to also be product accepted by the board for that use, which I explained a little bit earlier. Next question, will CPVC be allowed for gas venting if it meets the proper water piping standard but not a gas venting standard? And the answer is no. Water pipe standards are not gas venting standards. All piping must be listed for use as a gas venting material in order to be used. And with that, I'll take any questions. That takes care of section 5.
With regard to power vented water heaters, if no piping is compromised visually, can Schedule 40 PVC stay completely and just attach to a new vent hood, or does it have to be replaced to where it goes in the wall? The permit was pulled at the end of June 2021, so the new code was in place.
Okay, I'll repeat the question for those who might not have been able to answer it, to hear it. The question was if an appliance is being replaced and you don't need to use any piping, so that would be if you just disconnect the vent and reconnect it back to the appliance itself, can you use it or does it have to be replaced? And the answer would be at this point, you only have to bring whatever materials you're using up to the current code requirements. If it's a gas water heater that was installed and the permit was taken out in June of this year, it is after the code changed. But if the water heater, let's just say the water heater is the exact same heater you're replacing and there's been no changes to the size of it, and you can disconnect the clamp on the top of the heater and put the PVC back on, are you able to do that? And I would say at this point, in my opinion, the answer is yes. The board doesn't enforce the code. If that product was allowable at the time it was installed, if it was code compliant, then you only need to bring up to the current requirements whatever you're replacing.
With regard to venting materials, if a manufacturer calls for PVC as part of a venting option in the manufacturer's specifications, can IPEX be used?
Okay, that's a little tricky. The question is essentially, can PVC be used? Can IPEX PVC venting be used if the manufacturer of the appliances allows PVC? The answer is that IPEX has a product. Their 1738 product is approved and listed on the board's website as acceptable. That's PVC, but it does have a limitation of 149 degrees. They also have another product that's a CPVC that's tested to the 638 standard that is approved on the board's website. That's a much higher temperature piping as well. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, let's go on to section 10. 1006 materials. One of the items that was changed was that I don't know if you remember or not, but all of there were, I think, 4 or 5 pages of explanation for no hub or hubless soil pipe installations that were in the code. I think it was put in back in the early 2000s when no hub really became popular and it was fairly new. All those have been removed now. No hub is now tested to the SISB standard that for a soil pipe. So the board thought there was no reason to have the installation instructions all in there. There are installation instructions associated with hubless pipes. So that's the reason for the removal of all that information. Water distribution piping above ground inside a building. PEX, cross-link polyethylene pipe, PEX fittings and tubing was before allowable for up to 3 stories only. The board has now raised that to 6 stories. That brings it in line with CPVC for water piping. So now you can use either CPVC or PEX in a residential building for up to 6 stories. Under plastic pipe and fittings, the board made somewhat of a concession to the allowance of the use of, to allow the use of PVC in a non-residential installation. This is limited to a building that's predominantly residential with, and I'll read this to you because it's kind of hard to explain. PVC piping and fittings may be utilized in a building that's predominantly residential with a single non-residential use on a single floor that meets the following requirements. The non-residential use will be categorized exclusively as employee non-industrial with no other uses, and it's limited to a maximum of 4 plumbing fixtures, of which they can be a toilet, a sink being a lavatory, residential or service sinks, and a drinking water station. So this was essentially created for an apartment building that's being built, for example. So 8-story apartment building is going up, and the whole building is residential, and the only part that would have been considered commercial is just say on the first floor, a rental office. So previously, before this code change, the whole building could be piped in PVC, except for the one bathroom that would have to go in that small office that might be used by one person. In that case, what had to happen was they'd have to run cast iron from a point 10 feet outside the foundation wall. They would have to pipe that one bathroom in cast iron and copper, commercial materials, and they would have to extend that vent all the way up 8 stories through the roof, but the rest of the whole building could be PVC. So this was eliminated, but it is limited to employee non-industrial. So it can't be for a restaurant on the first floor. It can't be for some place of assembly where the public is coming in. This is just for employee non-industrial, and it's limited to those type of plumbing fixtures. So just be careful before you go and use PVC in that type of an installation. Make sure you're doing the right thing. All right, the next thing in section 10 is allowable materials on urinal waste. So the board has gotten rid of the requirement to pour lead and oakum joints. You can now use no-hub couplings with the elastomeric sealing sleeves, or you can use service weight piping with resilient gaskets. The resilient gaskets are now simply listed as allowable materials both above and below ground. There's no, it can be used anywhere in the plumbing system at this point. That would include the first 3 joints coming into the building. So previous to this, you had to pour lead and oakum joints for the clean out coming into a building. All of that's been removed now. So you can still pour lead joints. You don't have to. You can now use no-hub, or you can use resilient gaskets in lieu of pouring the lead joints. On to section 1010, number 12, automatic clothes washing machines. The waste discharge for a wash machine is now 2-inch. Used to be 1.5 inches, it's now increased to 2-inch. And that actually concludes section 10.
Wayne, can you tell us why the board decided to increase the laundry discharge from 1.5 inches to 2 inches?
Okay, the question was, why did the board increase the drain size, a minimum drain size from 1.5 inches to 2 inch on a laundry connection? My understanding is the reason that was done was that although washing machines typically now use quite a bit less water than they used to, they also have stronger pumps. And increasing the size of the waterway of the drain seemed like it was going to be a beneficial thing to do. Okay, this is the last section, section 11. There were quite a few changes made here. First off, for apprentice plumbers who were licensed after September 1st of 2008. The work experience for those apprentices was 8,500 hours. That was based on 1,700 hours worth of work time a year. So it took typically 5 years to accrue those 8,500 hours. The board has now dropped that to 6,800 hours. So an apprentice can get their requirement done within a 4-year period now, but it has to be over a period of not less than 4 years. As far as the education goes, the education stayed at all 5 tiers at 110 hours per tier, but apprentices may now complete 1.5 tiers per year. 165 hours each apprentice can do in 1 year now. So they're still able to, this allows them to get all of their work experience and education done within a 4-year period as opposed to the full 5 years. And then again, the one exception to that is they can still complete tiers 1 and 2 in 1 calendar year. On to continuing education as part of section 1104. The board made a few changes on the online and correspondence courses. If a licensee decides to go that route, either online or correspondence as opposed to the live class, they will now only have 2 attempts to pass the exam that comes with it. For those of you who might not know, the correspondence and online classes, the board's always required an exam at the end of it, and they need 70% or better to be able to consider that as a acceptable class. So now, if you don't pass that exam within 2 times, you must go back and take the live class. Another thing on continuing ed, the exemption that was previously there for those who were 65 years of age when a license cycle started, you all know that they didn't have to do those continuing ed classes after they renewed their license when they were 65. That has now gone away, and that's going to take effect on May 1st of 2022. So for all who were not doing their continuing ed classes that were over 65, you'll have to start doing the classes again after you renew your license on May 1st of 2022. The new exemption is no longer an age-based exemption. The new exemption will be you can apply for an inactive license, and that's not age restrictive. So but that inactive license will only allow you to work in your own single-family home. So you'd only be able to take out permits and work and do work in a single-family home. The board felt that just because someone was 65, if they were still working, still active in the industry, they needed the education, so remove that over 65 exemption. And with that, I think that ends section 11. I'll entertain any questions.
I'm an apprentice who has completed all 5 tiers to date. I'm 500 hours short on field experience though. With this new change, can I apply to sit for the test now, or do I have to wait for the additional 500 hours?
Good question. The way the regulation reads, you would be fine at this point, as long as you have the correct hours you need, which is now 6,800 hours. You can file to take the exam now. Any applications that get submitted to the board office at this point would never be looking for 8,500 hours anymore. It's definitely at 6,800 hours. That concludes our program for tonight. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd like to also give a special thanks to Joe Peluso and Charles Kild for representing the board here tonight. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me at PHCC. Thank you.